Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today it's time for another Plex Media server test, and today it is the turn of the DS723 Plus from Synology, released right at the start of 2023. This is the latest iteration of their DiskStation series that is taking advantage of the AMD embedded Ryzen that doesn't have integrated graphics, which I know a number of you are concerned about with regard to Plex performance. It is a 10 GBE upgradable NAS. It is a NAS with ECC memory, and it is a very, very capable system with DSM on board. But there's no denying that there are small concerns about server-side transcoding in conjunction with that CPU. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at 720p, we're going to be looking at 1080p, and we're going to look at a lot of 4K on this system. But the key words are the ones I just touched on there: server-side transcoding, or server-side conversion, depending on how you want to put it, because not all media is built equally, and indeed not all media devices are built equally. And in today's video, when we test a lot of this media, it's worth highlighting straight off the bat that we're going to be looking at different kinds of media. We're going to be looking at MKVs and MP4s, which we're all kind of used to there, and of course the high resolution is going to require a little bit more work by the system to play those files, but the key thing we need to consider there is to do with file compression, and that is the difference between HEVC, highly efficient video codec, otherwise known as H.265, and H.264, an older compression technique. Now, normally I would talk about this throughout the video, but because a number of you during my other Plex videos have highlighted this throughout the video, I think maybe it got skipped over. So I'm going to include it in the intro. Nice and simple. When you are watching films in the cinema that are enormous, a lot of the time those movies have to be compressed to make it onto home video. I say home video, what an old man am I, Blu-rays, DVDs and compressed files online. And of course that is an oversimplification, but effectively this compression technique is what compresses the multimedia into a contained portable format. Now, until the last few years, maybe 2016-17, H.264, an open source, widely used and freely available and accessible compression tool, was what was being used. But as far as hardware was getting bigger, as 4K and even 8K were folding in, they needed a better compression technique, and that is where HEVC, or H.265, was developed. And that was developed by a group of different organisations involved in multimedia, and therefore it is more privately owned. And the pattern behind it is shared. Everyone wants to wet their beak, and consequently, you do need a license to play it back on some devices. And in most cases, your client hardware provider will not include the license, because it's not easy to bulk buy licenses en masse for product. Consequently, a lot of the time you may be watching multimedia that is either too big to be utilised on your device. You're not going to watch an 8K version of a TV show on your mobile phone. What a waste of data, what a waste of space, and also a lot of hard work for your system to play those files. So you may hold these files that you've purchased online or downloaded or whatever, but when you do play them on other devices, maybe you are on limited internet connections like a train or a bus. Maybe you're in a hotel on the other side of the world, traveling through a VPN for your data. Maybe you're using a device that's very, very small and doesn't need that giant format, or will struggle under that big format. Or you're just using a device whereby you don't have a license to play back media, and either you don't have the hardware on your device to convert it on the client side, or the device you're watching it on doesn't even have the facility to encode that and reshape that file for you. So a lot of the time with a lot of these NASs, the hardware of the NAS is not going to be used really in any meaningful way until the system needs to do some of that work, because it can't be done on the client side. And I'm going to give you an example later on in this video using a Windows client tool, because a lot of you do highlight, why do I do these tests in the web browser? And the reason I perform the test of Plex Media Server in the web browser is I need to eliminate as much as possible client side management. I've got to make sure that my home system here, this laptop, is not doing much work. I need to show the NAS on its own doing as much work as possible. And if I was to use, for example, the Plex downloadable client application available for Windows here, and play back a file, it will use my system, my laptop's resources, to either convert that file or play the file in a way that the server will then be getting some time off. Just to put that into a little perspective, if we were to play back one of the more complex files, and this is a particularly complex file by the way, so we're not going to judge this system too harshly for not playing it, but say we go for this 100 megabits per second HEVC file here. Now, if I try to play that on this NAS here, because it doesn't have, the NAS doesn't have the license there, it will need to convert that file. So two things are going to happen. One, on the right hand side of the screen, as you see there, CPU utilization is going to skyrocket up to now nearly 100%. But on top of that, the file is just about barely buffering there in the background. And at the moment, it's taken longer than 7 or 8 seconds to buffer 7 or 8 seconds. So even if it plays, if this file was longer than 30 seconds, I don't think it would play back that file. This is a very extreme example, so don't hold anything against the NAS for having difficulty with a file of this scale. But as you can see there at the bottom, the file's going to need to stop because it just can't manage that whole file. But now if we use the Windows client application to play back that file, so again, DS723 there, we'll go into there, and what was it? It was the 100 megabits per second HEVC file. So if we do the same thing using the client application here, so we'll go back to detailed view, we find that 100 megabits per second HEVC file. If we play it in this format, it plays immediately. It's the same file on the same NAS, but this time, because I'm using my Windows laptop that has support of that conversion codec, the result is that it is able to play it. As you can see there, playing in the original file format there, playing in HEVC, and the NAS isn't having too much difficulty. The point I'm making is that although this NAS is going to struggle sometimes when we're utilizing dense files where licensing is going to be something of a barrier for those of you that need to transcode. If you don't need to transcode these files because you've got a license in place, you've got a hardware client device that is allowed to encode it, like an NVIDIA Shield, or you're utilizing a device that has a licensing on either side, or your entire collection doesn't have any HEVC, the experience you're going to have is going to be better. But I can't just show those results. I have to show, if not worst case scenarios, I have to show a more balanced scenario where the majority of users are not going to have the ability to transcode these things natively. So for those of you that are watching this video wondering why I'm showing transcoding, why I'm showing conversions, that's the reason why, and why I use the web browser overall. What a long introduction. Let's crack straight on with today's results. Right. So straight away, let's get it out of the way. First and foremost, let's get rid of me out the corner of the screen, because we are not going to need me here for this part of it, and it is only going to utilize a lot of resources unnecessarily. So let's remove me from OBS there, because otherwise that is going to undermine this just the tiniest bit. So again, we're going to go for something nice and easy there. We're immediately going to go into the likes of the Matrix here. Again, this is a 720p file there. It doesn't require any transcoding. This file is just going to play. It's just going to play straight away, no difficulties. We're playing over the network, original picture quality there. Nothing is going to register there on the side. We're going to be able to flick around. We're absolutely fine, no difficulty, no slowdown. Everything's fine there. So again, lovely stuff. Next up, try a different file. This time we're going to go within that 720 plus towards a 1080p file. So again, for this one, we go to Little Shop of Horrors. We play that file there. Once again, we're going to see no difficulties. It's the, it's a slightly higher bit rate, but it's only 1.9 megabits per second. We're going to be looking at some beefy things later on. But for now, we can skip ahead. Things are absolutely fine. Back, forward, up, down, absolutely fine. Original quality there, no difficulty. CPU, barely sweating. So next up, come out a Little Shop of Horrors, and now we can start making our way into something just a little bit beefier. Now we're going to look at 4K. So with the 4K files, what we need to do is go into our 4K test files there. And these are trailers. These are 4K trailers in a variety of different files and formats. So for example, we have Cave of Wonder. This is an H.264 file there. If we go ahead and play that immediately on the screen, this is a 4K file playing here on the DS723 Plus. Now, once again, even though this system doesn't have integrated graphics, the key takeaway here is that it's playing this file at its high quality in 4K, but it's doing so because it doesn't need the integrated graphics to change that file size. So just remember that when people are criticizing the likes of the 723 or the 923 for having an AMD embedded graphics component on board, it's only really going to hit you if you need server-side conversions. Yes, there are other reasons why you might want to take advantage of an integrated graphics processor, and there are advantages to it, but still no denying that it can play 4K files like this as long as you're not going to require conversions. So let's come out of that one. This next one is an example of when you're going to need conversions, because whereas that first file was an MP4 and it was 12 megabits per second and it was H.264, this is now going to be an HEVC, so it's going to require server-side conversions, and it's also 60 megabits per second bitrate, much higher than that 12 of the predecessor. Also, it's an MKV rather than an MP4 package. Consequently, the NAS is going to struggle with this file. If we bring that down and go into the corner, we can see that it is buffering it there, but what we're also seeing is that CPU up here is having to work harder, and that's kind of what we're going to see consistently. Two things: one, to play files that require conversions, we're going to have to work harder on that NAS on the client side, but also this is when playback is faster than it can transcode those and convert those files. Consequently, you end up with freezes in the presentation. And even though we're getting so good at playing it, we see the orange circle there, which is the buffering circle, which is no good to us, and ultimately why we would consider files like this an unfortunate failure in these tests. Next up, the beauty of Taiwan, another HEVC, this one half the megabits per second of its predecessor, so we get to have a better understanding of where the bottleneck was compared with that previous file there. Open it up. Bring that arrow on the bottom of the screen. Again, it is converting it, still converting it to 4K and still maintaining that bit rate, but it's converting it into something more palatable away from the HEVC conversion. Once again, we're seeing that CPU having to really crack out the extra horsepower there under the bonnet. On the bottom left of the screen, if we zoom in, we're able to see that again, we're seeing that buffering, but it's just not as good. It's a longer file than the previous one that we saw, and it will start playing this file certainly, but there's no doubt in my mind that playback is going to outpace that buffering there. So again, if you were looking at something like a full-length movie feature, unfortunately it's just not going to be able to play back something of this caliber because of that HEVC. Had this been an H.264 version, we wouldn't see buffering like you see that there on screen. So unfortunately, that is another fail there. Luckily, we're going to making our way back into H.264. So again, this time an MP4 bucket there at 16 megabits per second, so higher than that first file there. We can go ahead, and in theory, this should play fine. It's only really when you start exceeding the bit rate of around about 30 on H.264 non-compulsive conversion files where you will see any difficulties. But again, as mentioned several times before, when it comes down to it, if you aren't going to need server-side conversions or server-side transcoding, you're going to be absolutely fine there. You'll see plenty of buffering, plenty of playback, and only the tiniest little bump there on the right-hand side of the screen for that CPU. Although this might be the time to talk about the memory, because as you can see there, this system, although Plex is only really using a noticeable degree of memory when it was hitting those bottlenecks, the DS723 only has 2 gig of memory. So even when Plex isn't using any, just for baseline applications, I was still using well over half of the available memory on this NAS system. And that was using a lot of these applications when they were just running idle. Yes, I've got a decent number of apps here installed, quite a lot in fact, but there's only one camera in Surveillance Station. I've got no VMs running. I'm not running any containers. I've got one backup routine. Just these applications, mostly on idle, with all of the indexing completed. Yes, it's a lot of apps, but they're all on idle. So maybe think about upgrading that memory to 4 gig if you want to maximize your investment on your Synology NAS. But coming out of that, we can go into Dune, another H.265 HEVC file, and this time an even lower megabits per second compared with Beauty of Taiwan at 29 and the 60 megabits per second of Roast Duck. So we get to see if we do any better there with a lowered bit rate at the same 4K resolution. And again, most of these trailers range from around 400 megs to about 1.5, 1.6 gigabytes in size. These are hefty, hefty files. But still, we are seeing playback, but just not enough horsepower there to be able to convert this ahead. Now, to put this into a little bit of perspective, if you look at a NAS such as the DS1621 Plus with a quad-core embedded Ryzen that doesn't have integrated graphics, or even the DS3622 XS Plus, which has a 6 to 8 core, depending on which of the XS series you go for, Xeon processor, neither of which have integrated graphics, they make up for it by having raw power that is able to kind of smash through the task of these integrated graphics specialized processes just by sheer willpower. It's not efficient, but it gets the job done. Whereas this dual core AMD embedded Ryzen processor, it doesn't have the same level of oomph under the bonnet, and therefore it can't just blunder through the conversions in a way that an integrated graphics Celeron can do so with relative ease. But again, I'm going to call that a fail. We move on to number 6, another H.264 file at 32 megabits per second. Again, should be absolutely fine there, playing in original quality with a denser audio bit rate. Overall, still doing pretty good indeed. And it's playing this file straight away, no difficulties. The conversions there in the the buffering there in the background over the network running absolutely fine. CPU tiniest spike, but not really anything of note or concern. And overall, I'm happy with what I'm seeing there. And again, you can skip ahead right outside the buffer zone, and there should be virtually no delay. We're seeing just a few seconds delay there as we move forward because it is a 4K file, but still absolutely fine there. Finally, we can make our way on to, we're going to ignore Rise of Skywalker because that file is broken. We'll go make our way on to Batman. Very similar density and picture quality to that of the Spider-Man trailer we saw. And again, still running fine, slightly higher bitrate than one before it. We're seeing that tiny spike here on the right hand side for CPU utilization, but still running fine, buffering fine, staying well ahead, skip forward. How many seconds delay? Slightly higher than what we saw for Spider-Man. And we're still catching up there, but again, we are still talking about a 4K file. I'm happy with what we're seeing there, particularly with a decent couple of audio ranges available. Moving forward, Black Panther Wakanda, a bigger file here, 32 meg, 10-bit HDR and HEVC. So again, we're going to see some struggle here. I'll be pleased if it can run for 10 to 15 seconds without any slowdown or freezes, but I doubt it. That 2 gig of memory is clearly presenting something of a bottleneck, trying to find a way between playing both the Plex media file stuff and the system memory, which is already sitting pretty high at above half. And right there on the left hand side, we're really hitting like quite significant playback walls there because of those conversions that are taking place. And overall, I feel I'm going to have to write this off as a failure because we're seeing the orange circle of death there, one for you Xbox users. And then finally, we've got the last two files here. Avengers Endgame, again, should play absolutely fine. It's 40 megabits, so it's higher than all the other 264s we've tested, but still nonetheless, it should still play fine as it's that H.264. So once again, 4K is going to play on this. It's just going to come down to whether you need that server-side conversions. And I'm sorry to be so repetitious about it, but it's just I think this CPU in this family has received quite a lot of criticism, and a lot of the users that are going to be put off by that criticism would not have been affected by it. So yes, integrated graphics are going to be better for a Plex Media Server NAS, but it's not the be-all, end-all for all users. And if you intend to use this NAS to take advantage of things like the 10 GBE optional connection on it, the ECC memory, or DSM as a whole, it might well be that this isn't going to be something of a problem, particularly if you're using client hardware that supports HEVC. But with Avengers being a success, there is our biggest 4K trailer file, 80 meg H.264 file there. So this is where we push the boundaries of H.264 support, because it should play this file fine. But with this kind of density on this H.264, this is where we can find out the limit of how well this system can play an H.264 file that doesn't require server-side conversions. And really, this is our biggest non-converting file that we have to play with. And this is where we see limitations. Generally, when we were doing, say, the DS923, 60 megabits per second was just, it was the capping point for how much data could be sent through. Because remember, the minute you go quite high, you've got to think about overall network saturation, as you can talk about here, because we're connected via 1 GBE. It's still absolutely plenty, but still nonetheless, it does look like this file is going to be something of a high point for this system to try to tackle, even on H.264, and unfortunately it looks increasingly like it's not going to be able to play it there. So the cap we're finding is around 60 megabits per second of an H.264 file there, and although H.265 or HEVC is possible on this NAS, I think it's debatable just how well or effective that will be for you. But this has been Plex Media Server testing of this, the DS723 Plus. I've got reviews linked below to this NAS, along with some testing, some before you buys, and other things we're planning on this system throughout the next couple of months involve M2 NVMe pool testing, 10 GBE testing, and comparisons with DSM 7.2 around the corner of just what it can do for you, both home and business users alike. So do stay tuned for that. They should be linked in the description as and when they become live. Also, there are links in the description to other written articles over on NAS Compares, along with the free advice section if you need support from myself or Eddie. It's the big blue button on the right hand side of NAS Compares on all pages. Other than that, if you need to learn more, click subscribe as we go through this subject more and more. Click like if you've enjoyed the video, it helps me out. And finally, if you're going to consider buying any of the products that I talk about here on the channel, and if you found this helpful, and if you were going to go from Amazon anyway to buy your products, why not use the links in the description to take you there? It costs you nothing extra, and anything, and I really do mean anything you buy after that link takes you there, results in a kickback here to NAS Compares for me and Eddie here, the only people here on NAS Compares, and it allows us to keep doing what we do. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.